So when we talk about improving objectivity, by which I meant to convey that objectivity is a matter of degree. It's not as if you're objective or subjective, it's the extent to which you are objective. And I want to share with you an essay by Rav Dessler, a really extraordinary essay, where he describes Musar as a method of arriving at the truth. We all understand Musar to be self-examination and self-improvement. He wants to see this as a strategy for arriving at the truth. The one feature of arriving at the truth that he's addressing is objectivity. As he says, if you're going to perform any function using tools, the first thing you want to know is that your tools are good. If your tools are warped in some way or dysfunctional in some way, then that's going to affect the outcome of the project. We are all in the process of making up our minds what to believe and what not to believe all the time. One of the mental characteristics that has a big impact on the accuracy of those decisions is objectivity. We all know this from personal experience of other people's prejudices and biases. We find them very quickly, we point them out, and we learn to discard their opinions. Of course, as you have just guessed, looking in the mirror is not very common in this respect, but one should reflect in a sober moment, when one can find one, that if all these other people are affected by biases and prejudices and subjectivity, maybe we too have some biases, some prejudices. So, no, not me, only you. Now, Rav Dessler identifies two different types of challenges to objectivity, which require two different types of response. The first is something which, when I read it in his essay, I was surprised that I never come across it in my studies of philosophy. In general terms, it is the idea that every moral fault, every moral vice compromises your objectivity. There's a link between what the philosophers would call value theory and epistemology. And although in typical philosophy there are discussions of some links, they're not a lot and they're not very strong, this link is never mentioned. I'll leave it to you to try to figure out why that might be. Well, that's what I want to point out to you first, is that every moral fault implies a worse objectivity, a lessening of objectivity. And then secondly, Rav Dessler says that the process of investigation carries with it necessarily an attack on objectivity, something that undermines objectivity. The very fact that you are investigating anything will imply a challenge to objectivity. Now here, in the case of moral vices, you could say, theoretically, the solution is be a saint. Don't have any moral vices, and all the threats will go away. Theoretically, that's true. And the more you push yourself in that direction, the more objective you'll be. The second type of challenge, where it's built into the investigation itself that there is bias, the only way to solve that problem is never to investigate anything, which is not a very useful solution. The goal is to be able to investigate in an objective fashion. So here, you can't avoid the threat, can't eliminate the threat, you have to overpower the threat. And that requires a separate set of strategies. So let's start with the moral vices, and let's go through a few, one by one, and I'll show you where they impinge. And this isn't the only place where I may not even be aware of all of them, but it gives you an idea of how the logic works. Let's take laziness. A lazy person looks to avoid the expenditure of effort. Sometimes when you're mounting an investigation, trying to decide what to believe about some subject, the investigation, to be thorough, requires a lot of work. requires a lot of research, a lot of comparison with other people, a lot of thinking, analyzing. And the temptation is to cut down the work by only perusing, let's say, half the evidence. And then you rationalize and say, well, if it doesn't come from Princeton and Harvard, it's not worth seeing. Well, maybe Oxford will come in as a secondary. And that way you justify reducing it. Or if the argument is complicated and difficult, to look for summaries and shortcuts. And then laziness prevents you from conducting a thorough investigation, which means that the conclusion that you draw will be less objective than if you had had the strength and persistence to conduct a thorough investigation. And that's a pretty easy case, simple case. There's another case that's a little bit more complex. And by the way, Odessa quotes the Maharal here, who has a very interesting insight. When you look at Jewish courtroom procedure, you can see that some of the rules are designed to promote objectivity in psychological terms. So, for example, here is a Jewish courtroom rule. You're a judge, and you're going to hear a case with two litigants, Reuven and Shimon. And the way it takes place, one litigant presents his arguments, the other litigant presents his arguments, and then you as the judge will ask questions and try to settle it. Okay, the hearing is scheduled for 3 o'clock. Reuven is sitting there at 5 to 3, ready to go. And Shimon calls up at 2 minutes to 3 and says, I'm stuck in traffic, I'll be there at 3:20. So you as a judge say, well, look, only one person can talk at a time. And Reuven is here, and according to the laws of how these investigations are undertaken, he does have the right to speak first, so there's no harm in letting Reuven speak. And then when Shimon comes, it'll be his turn to speak. Jewish law forbids that. One litigant cannot speak unless the other litigant is present. Now, why is that? As we said, only one person can speak at a time. You're not allowed to interrupt him. So, says Rav Dessler, imagine the scenario. I'm sitting, I'm the judge, Reuven is here, Shimon is here, and Reuven is speaking. What do I see? What's going on in my mind? Well, this is what Reuven is saying, but look, Shimon's right there. He's ready to go. He's not looking cowed. He's not looking beaten. He's not looking defeated. I'll bet that Shimon has answers to what he's saying. So I'm reserved. I'm withholding my judgment. I'm not going to be overwhelmed by Reuven's eloquence and his being positive and the force of his emotions, because Shimon is there and I see him as ready to respond. That's not the same as if Reuven is speaking and Shimon's on his way in the car. That psychological guard which causes me to be cautious and not to overly identify with Reuven isn't there. That's why you're not allowed to hear one litigant without the other litigant being present. I mean, there are exceptions, but that's the general rule. Okay, now, let's translate that into my own investigation. Let's suppose I'm investigating some subject and I'm reading up the literature, and it's going to take me about 2 weeks to go through the literature. It seems clear to me. After 1 week, someone says, hey, how's it going? How does it look so far? Well, let's see. If I say, looks like XYZ, next week when I start looking at more evidence, I've already committed myself to XYZ. I'm going to see the new evidence in a different light. I'm going to see it as an attack. I'm going to exercise myself to defend myself against it because I have already rendered a preliminary judgment, and it will call to question my judgment and my analytical abilities and evaluative abilities if I have to now give it up. So one of the ways to promote your objectivity is beware of premature judgments. Force yourself not to do that. Say, I'm not going to draw any conclusions. I'm not going to try to arrive at any conclusions until I've seen all the evidence. This is a gift that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me when I made my investigation of traditional Judaism. I was not religious at all. I was an atheist. I said I'm going to try things out and I'm not going to make any conclusions at all. Let's just see, let's gather evidence and see where it goes. After about 2 years, I kept my mind quite reasonably open. I wasn't such a clever person at the time, and it wasn't so smart, but it was just a natural response that I had to the investigation. Vesta says that this idea of drawing a preliminary conclusion is a threat to your objectivity, and you should work to have an uncommitted mind until you at least have perused all the evidence. That's a second area, because of the person not to have an opinion, to have to say that you don't know. That's something which today is something you fight an uphill battle. What's your opinion on gender pronouns or transgender or the history of segregation in the United States? What's your opinion? Not only are we told that everyone has a right to his own opinion, everyone has an obligation to have an opinion. To say, I don't know? What do you mean you don't know? You hear what's going on. You understand what's going on. What's your opinion? What do you think is right? If you think about it, that's insane. Why should I have an opinion on every subject? When I was in university, I used to teach my students the Einstein board debates. After I present both sides, the students always ask, well, who's right? Who are you asking? Me? I'm just happy I can enrich my life a little bit by learning what these people said. And by the way it was presented then, almost universally, it was dead wrong. It's been rethought and look at Philip Paul's book, wonderful book, Beyond Weird, and other Susan Hassenfelder's book, articles on the subject. They taught it all wrong. They taught it as a dispute about determinism. It was a dispute about instantaneous action at a distance. And Bohr didn't win, he lost. The histories of it were... Anyway, so why should I have an opinion on something that I'm not expert in? I haven't studied, that I'm not experienced in. So, but this is what it requires. It requires to say, I don't know, and be prepared to defend the idea that you don't know. So that's number two, the ability to withhold judgment before you've perused at least all the relevant information, or all the information you're going to peruse before you draw a conclusion. And then there's the idea of what's called intersubjectivity. Sometimes people use intersubjectivity as at least a stepping stone to objectivity. Intersubjectivity means you've got to take appropriate account of other people's positions. Now, of course, I put in a weasel word, appropriate. Who decides what's appropriate? Okay, that's true. That's true. One key to it is this. Whatever criteria you use to disqualify someone else's opinion, you have to be prepared to use to disqualify your opinion. So, we're all sitting together at a social gathering, all 16 of us, and all 15 of you are drunk. Only I am not drunk. And now 15 of you swear that a pink elephant's coming through the door. Do I have to give in because it's 15-1? No, I don't. Because you're all drunk, and I'm not drunk. But it does mean that if I'm drunk, I shouldn't trust my own opinion either. So taking adequate account of other people's opinions means to take them seriously and to evaluate them by standards that you're also prepared to apply to yourself. Reflect that the truth about any non-trivial subject is known by the vast majority of people in the world, half the people in the world, 10% of the people in the world, 1% of the people in the world, 1/10 of 1%. What would you guess? Sailboating, macrobiotic diet, ancient Chinese history. Pick any subject you like. What percentage of the world's population is thoroughly familiar with the subject? A very small percentage. So you certainly don't want to just take a vote. But when you're going to disqualify people because of lack of knowledge, lack of experience, lack of information, lack of brain power, then you have to do the same for yourself. Yeah.
So you mentioned consistent standards. So with like personal experience of a personal religious experience, for instance, is that good enough evidence then to justify religious belief if other people have, let's say, different religious experiences from different religions? As in, can I say, if I'm having this particular experience, I'm able to justify my particular religious belief, knowing that other people have completely different religious experiences, a different...
Well, that will be a very serious question, because if I'm going to justify mine on the basis of my experience, then I will have to treat the others as justified on the basis of their experience, unless I can distinguish between the experiences. And then I will not have a consistent picture. That's quite right. That's the idea of taking them with equal validity, equal authority. I mean, to subject them to the same kinds of critiques. So if I think that my experience is sufficient for my belief, then unless I have some way to distinguish, I would have to say that their experience is sufficient for their belief, and then I have to live in a world where both beliefs are justified, and if they contradict one another, I haven't got a clear picture. I can't avoid that. One of the really very good philosophers Alvin Plantinga, a very religious Christian philosopher and a first-rate, top-notch philosopher. 1 year, a couple of decades ago, he wrote 3 volumes that were published the same year by Oxford, defenses of his Christian faith, 2 of which dealt with matters in general philosophy, and 1 was specifically designed to defend the Christian faith. And he put forward a very sophisticated defense of his Christian belief. And he writes there, I know that a Jew or a Muslim could put forth a parallel defense of their faith. Now, my defense is based on a certain type of experience, and know that they could and do claim to have similar experiences. And although conceivably I could describe my experience as superior to theirs, having nuances that they don't have, depth they don't have, inspiration they don't have, but I think that he says that would be prejudicial. I don't know that to be the case. I couldn't prove that to be the case, and therefore I'm not going to say it. And he's facing it exactly that way. So he's saying, as far as my defense goes, it could be used for these religions which are in certain senses incompatible with mine, and I would have no way to solve that incompatibility. And that was very honest. So I think that's exactly right. You can't, unless you can show systematically there's some superiority that you have, and it's not because it carries my name with it, then you have to treat it as equally valid. So now this is one type of problem, that is to say, not being willing to extend to everyone else equal initial credibility. That's often driven by pride. I can't be wrong, because I'm smarter than other people, and I know better than other people. And somebody contradicts me, he's got to be worse. It's got to be, because I'm best. Now, if intersubjectivity is the way in which you can test objectivity, it's not the be-all and end-all, it's not the last consideration, but it's one way. If I can't admit anybody else's opinion because it endangers my pride, then pride makes me less objective. It's well known in heart medicine. There was a journal which was run by a certain editor, and of course the editor himself was an eminent researcher in heart medicine, and he would never publish any paper that contradicted him. He just wouldn't. He's not promoting objectivity in heart research. Because his pride wouldn't allow him to do that. So pride as a moral vice is something which endangers his objectivity. It's very hard to find a moral vice which, if you apply it to the reasoning process, will not issue in some kind of weakness of objectivity. Fairness of treatment is another application of this same type of intellectual failure. Fairness means you have a set of rules that are objective and fit everyone. And the rules should be crafted in such a way as to promote the activity at hand. And if you don't have this commitment to fairness, then you will craft different rules for different people, and you will thereby not take adequate account of their opinions. That also will compromise your objectivity. So here, as I said, in this general category, the ideal would be just to be a saint, not to have any moral failures at all, in which case all these problems of objectivity would just simply disappear. That's one category. The second category, which is more subtle and calls for an entirely different response, is where the very process of investigation creates a bias in how the investigation is conducted and what the outcome shall be. And he gives the following example. Imagine someone who's investigating whether or not it's permissible, according to Jewish law, to play chess on Shabbos. Why do you think he's investigating that law?
Because he wants to play in chess.
9 times out of 10, because he wants to play chess. 1/2 a time out of 10, because a friend of his, wants to play chess and is asking him to investigate it for him, right? Well, if the point of the investigation is to lead to the outcome that you can play, you're not going to look at the sources objectively. You're going to look at the sources in such a way to get the answer that you want. Now, sometimes it's gross, like you're convinced, you're looking it up as a matter of duty, but you've already made up your mind. It's got to be this way. Any other way is crazy. And then you're going to make gross distortions of the information that you peruse. But sometimes you may think that you're objective. Yeah, I would like to play chess on Shabbos. I really would be very happy with a yes answer, but I can be objective. I can look at it fairly, but then you're fooling yourself. Because every preference for one outcome over the other is going to unbalance your evaluation of the sources that you look at. And, Rav Dessler says, every investigation is driven by interest. There's a reason why you undertake some investigations and not others. That's driven by interest. Interest is what you desire to have, or what you're afraid of and you desire to avoid. That means these desires that you have are going to make the investigation unbalanced. Now, when I have said this to people, some people object and say, that's not true that every investigation is driven by interest. After all, when I was a kid, I read the encyclopedia from Aardvark to Zizigy, with everything in between. All 20 volumes. I didn't have any preconceived notions. I just was interested in knowing things, and I took them at random. Well, really? At random? Well, then why don't you just read the telephone book? Every line has another fact, another brand new independent fact. Every moment you're reading another fact, and it's 3,000 pages long. That'll keep you busy for a while, right? Why don't you do that? Or why don't you count the grains of sand at Jones Beach? You'll be the only one in the world who'll know the number of grains of sand at Jones Beach, right? It's a brand new. You'll discover it, right? Of course, nobody wants to know the number of grains of sand at Jones Beach, so that's why nobody does it, right? No, you are selective in the things that you investigate. Dessler gives the example, you take the same newspaper, in those days, pieces of paper, you can read about it in history books, right? You turn the page, and give the same newspaper to 10 people, and give them 25 minutes to read the whole newspaper, and then tell them to put it down and ask them questions about the articles, you'll find that accuracy of the answers from article to article will vary greatly. As someone who's not really interested in sports will look at that for like 90 seconds and pass it over and go on to something else. Somebody else in the stock market, some people will pay attention, some people won't. When you come to the op-ed page, which you really should skip, but then it depends upon your politics and your intellectual training, intellectual interest, what things you will take at like pablum, what things you'll take critically, and so on and so on. It's going to vary from person to person because your interests vary. I don't know if you had the experience of walking down the street and noticing a trail of ants crossing the street. Some people want to see where they're coming from, that discarded bun, and where they're going to, that hole in the ground. And other people will say, get out of my way, or won't even notice it. People investigate the things that interest them, and your interests depend upon what your desires are, even if the desire is to have something interesting to tell at the next cocktail party. That's also something that drives your interest. So since interest drives investigation, and interest almost always will create a bias for the outcome of the investigation, that means the process of investigation has built-in bias. And that being the case, you're not going to avoid this bias by eliminating the bias, because that would mean to eliminate all investigation. So what you have to do is conduct the investigation with the inbuilt bias and somehow try to protect yourself from that bias. Protect yourself from the bias affecting the outcome. Now, the way you do that is that you put in place certain institutions, certain practices, and certain rules that create a commitment and how shall I say, guidelines that strengthen your commitment to the truth, so that your commitment to the truth can overcome this inherent bias. Eliminating is not possible, but you can overcome it. And when you think about Jewish culture, so to speak, Jewish individual and communal practice, I think you can see that we have many such practices and institutions in place which help to strengthen our commitment and our connection to the truth. One of them is chavrusa learning. Chavrusa learning works like this. It's usually two people, could be more, but usually two people. They're studying a certain text together, and one reads and explains the text, and the other one shoots him down. It's okay, because tomorrow they reverse positions. This one reads, and that one shoots him down, right? Now, imagine you're reading. What's going on in your mind? How shall I explain this? If I say it this way, what could he say? How could he attack it? Where would he come from? Oh, I see. He could use what I said yesterday. And this I'm saying today, put them together, and he showed me that I'm contradicting myself. Well, I better change my mind. Well, give me a minute. Let me work on this. That's not a good way to present it. The chavrusa, the system, encourages, demands self-criticism, self-examination. Can't just sail along on what makes you happy or inspires you, because the other guy is going to shoot you down. So you internalize that. You become your own critic, your own self-critic. That's very valuable. When I taught university, I tried to get my graduate students to study for exams together or even write papers together. Absolutely not. They refused categorically. When I was a graduate student, I had two friends, both of whom were non-Jewish, and we studied for exams together. And it made a tremendous difference because you share what you know, what you understand. I said to my students, why don't you study together? Because if I have an idea and I tell it to him, he's going to get credit for that idea, even equally to me. I said, first of all, don't you think the faculty is smart enough to figure out which one of you thought of it? We know you, right? You know, you talk in class, we can figure that out. I said, but even so, let's suppose he gets credit for it. So what? You'll understand the material so much better. I couldn't get them to do it. I could not appeal enough to get them to do it. Wendell Weinbach, was one of the founders of Ohr Somayach, had a degree in education. I think it was from City College in New York. And he wrote a thesis on yeshiva education. And one of the people who evaluated his thesis said, "You're so far ahead of us in American education, we wouldn't even know what steps to take to move in your direction." That's what he told. And this, the Chavrusa method is a tremendous aid in that regard. Now that's one thing. Another thing in yeshiva education is, if you are studying in a base medrash, let's say with 200 guys, there's an unwritten rule that if you and your chavrusa are in trouble and you can't figure something out, you can stop somebody else and ask for help. And an advanced student can't say, "Well, I'm doing advanced research, so don't bother me. Talk to somebody else with your elementary question." You don't do that because it's a communal effort. It's a communal responsibility. And someone who's more advanced has a responsibility to help people who are less advanced. Then, in addition, yeshivas hire people to stand there in the room to answer questions, called a meshiv. Just think of how you have to make an appointment. You want to speak to a professor or even a graduate student, and have to make an appointment, and 2 weeks from now, it'll give you 20 minutes, and so on and so on. He's standing there. Walk over to him and ask your question. So, when I was an undergraduate, I wrote papers. Graduate student. You're sitting in the library, absolute silence. Hear a pin drop. You write your paper in absolute isolation. You and the paper. That's it. You go through things in your mind. You come to an idea. You write it down. You make the best case for it that you can. You hand it in. Let's say it's a midterm paper. You get it back a week later with a grade. D, C. Okay, you're a little disappointed. So you make an appointment with the professor 2 weeks later, and then here you have instant feedback. Instant feedback. You have it from your chavrusa, you have it from the oldest students in the room, you have it from the meshiv. You don't have time to fall in love with your idea. You don't have time to feel that you have to defend your idea. You put it up, you get a response, you deal with the response, you try to evaluate it. That's a tremendous pressure for the truth built into the institution, the way that the material is studied. Similarly, you have the Rosh Yeshiva, or whoever gives the shir. The Rosh Yeshiva, when he walks into the room, everyone stands up. When you're praying together as a group, everyone waits for him to finish before the repetition starts. He gets a lot of honor. Oh yeah, a lot of honor, till he opens the book. When he opens the book and starts to talk, it's open season. You can interrupt, you can yell, you can shout, you can argue, right? And it's all part of the educational process. In fact, the story is told about Rav Aaron Kotler, who founded the Lakewood Yeshiva, that he had a student who used to write down his lectures in notebooks. Very, very careful, very knowledgeable student. And one day they were having in the shir they had a debate, and the student was arguing with Rav Aaron. And in the time of the period of the day, they didn't resolve the debate. So, and Rav Aaron was apparently quite forceful in expressing himself. And that afternoon, Rav Aaron apparently felt maybe I was too forceful and I pushed too hard, so he called the student in. He said, "Listen, the thing we studied about, talked about this morning, hope I didn't embarrass you, and I hope that I didn't, push too hard, and, hope that it was okay the way we..." So the student said, "That's fine, it's no problem." He gets up to go, he says, "But I'm right, you're wrong." Okay, they started shouting and yelling and screaming, and fine. Years later, Rav Aaron remembered some shir or other that he had said, and knew the student kept very careful notes. So he said, "Please show me your notebook from that shir. I want to remember, see how you took down what I said." Fine, he gets the notebook, Rav Aaron gets the notebook, and he looks and says, "Oh, that's the shir that we fought about." Now, what this student used to do is, he'd write down the shir on one side of the page, and he'd write his responses on the other side of the page. So Rav Aaron thought, I wonder I wonder what he wrote on the other side of the page. Turns over the other side of the page. Rav Aaron's wrong for this reason and this reason. He calls him in years later. You say I'm wrong. And they started yelling and screaming all over again. Rav Aaron was one of the world's greatest scholars. So what? So what? You have your fantasies about religious authority and inability to think and inability to question and your robots. Not our religion. Take that elsewhere. Sell that garbage elsewhere. That has nothing to do with us. I'm not saying it applies elsewhere either, but don't try to pin it on us. The openness and the implied equality before the book. You know, if you're 6'5" and I'm 5'10", if we're standing in front of Everest, we're effectively the same height. You're standing in front of a Gemara, so at that point, it's open season. So if you're looking for a method of getting to the truth where everyone's argument is taken seriously and taken and given hearing, I had the great privilege of studying with Rav Kozhelevsky, should be well, for a whole year when I first came to Israel. And the debates and the fights and the screaming was coming from universities, it was really something to get used to. But everything was on the table. Everything was open for discussion. Everything was open for debate. So that's certainly a safeguard to promote the truth. Then there's a question of values. Who are our heroes? Who are the people who we look up to and look as models? It's not only a question of the truth, but it's largely a question of the truth. The Gemara tells a story that Hillel was trained as a scholar in Babylonia, and he came to the land of Israel. It was totally unknown. He came to the yeshiva and sat. There was a discussion going on. A certain question came up, and people tried their best to understand it and answer it. Only he could answer it. And they said, okay, so you take over. You take over. Take over? I have a chair, excuse me, an endowed chair. What do you mean he should take over? In Prague, was it Rabbi Jonas at Eibschitz? I think so. I'm getting mixed up, whoever it was. There was a yeshiva, and Jonas was a businessman. And one day in the yeshiva, they were discussing a certain issue, and the Rosh Yeshiva left them with a question and said, go home and think about it. Next day they come in, and he said, did anybody think about the question? So one student raised his hand and said, how about this for an answer? So the Rosh Yeshiva said, wow, that's a good answer. So the boy said, well, actually, it's not my answer. I was on the way home. I saw Yonason, and I asked him the question. This is the answer that he gave me. Okay, Rosh Yeshiva was impressed. Another boy raised his hand and says, well, that's very strange, because I met Rabbi Yonason on the way home also. I asked him the same question. He gave me a different answer. Turned out he had given a different answer to each of the boys in the yeshiva, and they were all good answers. At which point the Rosh Yeshiva said, I resign. Rabbi Yonason is clearly a much better scholar than I am, and therefore I resign. Now, I taught university for 10 years. I saw the battles over academic positions. Two of the leaders in my area of philosophy were at Harvard, Willem van Orman Quine and Nelson Goodman. And there was a student who got his PhD from Harvard, and the question was whether they should appoint him to the faculty at Harvard. His name was Saul Kripke. And they said, no, because he doesn't do our style of philosophy. We don't want him around. So he went to Princeton and became one of the major philosophers of the 20th century. But they didn't do their style of philosophy. Another fellow who got his undergraduate degree, got his PhD from Harvard, and this was in Jewish studies, and he was taken as a beginning faculty member at Yale, but he happened to be observant, and he was told quite clearly, you won't get tenure here. We don't take people who are observant. We just don't do that. And he went back to Harvard and became a professor at Harvard. I don't think he lost out, but it was very clear that he wasn't going to get tenure at Yale, because we don't do that. So that's quite different from saying this person is a better scholar than I am, and I resign in favor of of him. So we have this in our literature. As I say, these people are our heroes. Chaim Brisker, who revolutionized yeshiva study everywhere. In fact, some say that he wrote his ideas as explanations of the Rambam, because had he written them as explanations of the Gemara, it would have been so radical that people would have been worried about it. So he wrote about the Rambam, as if to say it's a less high-powered area of research, but he revolutionized Torah study everywhere in the yeshiva world. He was called to give a shiur at a conference in Europe, and he got up and he started speaking, and halfway through he stopped and he said, "Everything I have told you is incorrect," and he sat down. He realized halfway through that it was just not right, so he just said it's incorrect and sat down. I witnessed, because like many philosophy departments, we would invite other faculty members from other schools to come and speak, and we would sit and listen, the faculty and the graduate students, and then discuss what we heard. And from time to time, at that time, Johns Hopkins was voted number 15 out of more than 100 graduate programs in philosophy in the United States. So we were reasonably high up. And sometimes the speaker would get caught. It's quite clear that he got caught. Almost never did he admit that he was caught. Almost never did he admit that he was wrong. He qualified, and you didn't take that into account, and look what I wrote elsewhere, and he would make excuses. That was quite transparent to everyone that he didn't know what he was talking about, but he wouldn't give in, wouldn't admit that there was a mistake. I remember certain challenges to certain philosophers. And when I want a person's name, I have tremendous trouble. There was a woman who was a professor at Princeton in ancient philosophy, and she came down and read a paper. There was one guy there, an art faculty, who also did ancient philosophy. He thought of himself as really something really terrific, and he tried to pull down what she was saying. And Margaret, I can't think of her last name. And she sat there in perfect composure, and she simply said, "No, Aristotle said it this way, and in the Greek it's said this way, and this is the way it's taken over in the Latin." Oh, she was just, but he pretended not to accept the answers, and pretended that it wasn't true, and so. There's so much sheker, so much lack of appreciation for truth, lack of sense of when we're arguing with one another, we're working together to try to find the truth. When I was at Merkas Rav Kook for a year, and my mother, Allah Shalom, was a lawyer, so she came to visit me in the middle of the year, and I enabled her to be able to observe what's going on in the Beis Medrash from a point where she wouldn't be seen. And then I came out to talk to her, and she said, "Why did they hate each other so much?" Now, if you've seen a Beis Medrash, you know what I'm talking about, right? And she was the valedictorian of her law class at NYU, so she was really very good in her profession. But the idea of arguing it out and yelling and screaming and pounding the table, when they love each other, they're committed to each other. The most precious thing in the world is that kind of relationship. So that's another safeguard for the idea of truth, that there's nothing like it. Then for children, there's a value of what's called vitur. Vitur means giving into the other person, giving up for the other person. And we praise the children and reward them for doing that. So one of my grandchildren had the following experience. Now, if you're not aware of these things, it's going to sound outside the realm of possibility. Too bad. Maybe you'll wake up someday. They're Slonim Chasidim, and one of the things they practice, which others practice as well, is called Chamishos, 5 hours. 5 hours of uninterrupted study for an 11-year-old. Find me that anywhere today, anywhere. And the kids do it as a matter of pride. That means no interruption means not only no coffee breaks, it means no speech of any kind that isn't related to the subject of study. Okay, he was. And this is a Maisa Glura, as an 11-year-old, you're out to prove your strength and your abilities. And he was in the middle of one of these sessions when a friend of his sitting next to him made a grand gesture and knocked his glasses off. And his glasses fell to the floor. The other boy didn't stop learning. So my grandson said to himself, I heard this from his mother, he said to himself, maybe he thinks he broke my glasses. And maybe he's worried about that. Should I break my 5 hours to tell him that the glasses are okay, or shouldn't I? This is an 11-year-old. And he said, yes, I should break my 5 hours to tell him so he won't worry. Find that kind of consideration and wanting the other child to know the truth so that he'll be able to not be worried about what's going on. So when you have children who are instilled with this kind of value, and they're held up as examples, so then you're also reinforcing that value. Now, I want to finish with one more thing, which Rav Dester, at least, I think he hints at it. He doesn't stress it, but I think it's very important, and if you have questions, I'll take them. So now we have the very nature of an investigation has an inbuilt bias, and you have something which has to stand as an opposition to it to overcome the bias. Is this an external means, or is it built also into the investigation? Is there something, as much as there is bias built into the investigation, is there a pressure to find the truth also built into the investigation? So let's go back to the example with which we started. He's just investigating whether you can play chess on Shabbos. Okay. And he wants to play chess on Shabbos, so he's definitely biased. But he's investigating. He isn't just playing. What's pushing him to investigate? Because he also wants to know the truth. Also. So that means, in addition to the fact that every investigation has in it a bias for a particular outcome, the initial investigation also has in it a pressure to find the truth, otherwise you wouldn't bother investigating. You just play. So when you're talking about these external aids, they're external aids that promote an already given internal motivation to find the truth. And I think that that's very important. Because now I'm speaking outside my field, but I don't think in psychologically, that you could invent a whole category of motivation if it wasn't there beforehand. You could strengthen it, or you could weaken it, but to invent it out of whole cloth, I don't know that could be done. Everything's bridged on something else, stuff that's already there, and then develops it in a further way. It's very important to see that the pressure for truth is built in. And the reason why, one reason why the pressure of truth is built in, as I have one of my chapters in my book, is that the truth is enormously useful in all areas of life. There are many, many things that you cannot do at all, or you cannot do nearly as well as when you know the truth. So when we talk about bias and prejudice is distorting an already present commitment to find the truth. And then our job is to strengthen that. And that's the way in which you strengthen your objectivity. Yeah. Questions? Yeah.
So kind of going back to the thing we talked about before, what gives us reason to think, for instance, that Jewish religious experience is meaningful compared to other religious experiences? And also, if we say, for instance, that we have reason to believe that Jewish religious experience or the content of it is true, I don't see how that would actually make a difference, considering other religions, even if they're wrong, still think that their experiences are true, and they still have these experiences.
Well, I don't know. I know where you're starting from. I'm not aware of any great literature that says our experiences are self-verifying. Because we have these experiences, therefore our beliefs are true?
Not that, but rather, should we think our experiences are true?
But that's not what you asked a moment ago at all. This is black and white.
Yeah.
One is that the experience itself is reason to think that my beliefs are true, and the other is to think that my experiences aren't hallucinations.
I don't mean the first one. I don't mean that we should take the religious experiences themselves to bring proof, but rather, why do we hold them to be true to begin with? Not that they served us as just reason.
Well, I guess it will depend upon which experiences you're talking about. But if an experience is, I go through this to a certain extent in my book also. If experience is something which is had simultaneously by a large number of people, and if it's embedded in a certain particular process, an historical set of events that would lean on one another, so then the very continuity gives it credibility like it would in any other area of life. Right? You're freed from Egypt. In Egypt, you're told, I'm taking you out in order that you should serve me on the mountain. And you end up on the mountain, and you actually do serve God on the mountain. So those two experiences are mutually verifying. Each one depends upon the other. Each one refers to the other, and both of them are there to help verify each other. It's like supporting evidence in any argument. We have a lot of pieces of evidence. Each piece of evidence supports the same conclusion that the law works or the case works or whatever it is. It's no different from evaluating evidence in any other area of life.
In cases where it's not a tradition, but rather just certain, I know people make claims of, when they're Doviding or something, there seems to be a certain, religious experience or a certain closest connection, rather those elements.
You mean where you feel that you're experiencing something outside of yourself that's real?
Yes.
Well, if I have objective evidence that the thing is real, independent of my experience, then when I have the experience, I have some reason to think that it's not just subjective, but it's also objective.
And the point I was trying to bring up before with that was that other people.
Suppose I say, I read in the newspaper that something absolutely phenomenal has been cited, unlike in the history of the world, pink elephants flying in the sky. And it's not April 1st. Right? So then I walk outside and I see pink elephants in the sky. I'm much less likely to think it's a hallucination, since it was reported in the end. And other people said they saw it. All right, and then we shot bullets up to the sky, and then they started to bleed. And so at that point, I'm going to say that when I see it, it's probably real rather than a hallucination. So if I have a reason to think that something genuine is going on here, and then I have an experience, that gives me reason to think that the experience is valid, not just subjective.
But wouldn't you also have reason not to think that the experience you have is valid if other people of different religions say they have certain sense of religious experiences connected to beliefs in gods that contradict ours? They also have the experience.
Well, then it's tricky. I write about this in a certain point in my book. You can distinguish between the experience itself on the one hand and the belief to which it leads on the other hand. And I could say the experience is real, and it is an experience of something real, but you don't understand what you see. Just like when people used to think that solid tables are solid because they're solid all the way through, with no empty space. Nature abhors a vacuum, as they said in the poetical ancients, right? And therefore, but the truth is it's almost 99% empty space. It's almost all empty space. Really? Okay. But so they had tables, they felt tables, they could predict what will happen with tables, they just didn't understand what tables were. So a person can have an experience of something real, but not understand what it is and what it means. Right? We have an expression, emes v'sholom ehavu. Truth or reality and peace you should love. Right? Now suppose somebody says, just cuts off the first one. It says, sholom ehavu. Should love peace. Okay. Sometimes. When it doesn't compromise emes, right? Somebody makes a whole religion out of sholom ehavu, love peace. What would I say? Well, sort of. Sometimes, but not always, and you're not really understanding what its value is because you didn't put it after emes, so you haven't really got it right. Is it just wrong? Is it just a hallucination? No. Sholom ehavu are real words. They come from a real source. It's just that without the emes, they're not getting it, right? So when you say that The experience is a real experience. And it's experience of something real that's outside of it. And it leads to certain beliefs. That third step, I don't have to accept when I can credit the first two steps. I think it's quite common. Sometimes I will say that the Torah expresses a point, and so students will say, but Christianity believes that. And I say, so? Maybe they got something right, We're not anti-Christianity. We are what we are. If they happen to agree, so much the better, right, for them. And if they don't agree, so then they have something to learn, right? So I don't have to. I have to be exclusivistic in that sense. Okay.